Yeah, I'd like to thank Alexandra for inviting me and her colleagues at ZIMM. I feel you've already more or less presented my my paper, so I'll just take questions. But yeah, seriously, I was trained as a chemist in the UK as an undergraduate, and then I came to CUNY in the late 80s, to study political science, not knowing anything about political science, and certainly not knowing anything about American political science. And it was a real shock to me, you know, my first year at CUNY. I wasn't too happy. And then I discovered the New School. And, you know, we had a great deal where you could take courses anywhere in New York. So I was very fortunate to be able to take two great courses here during my MA program. So it's really nice to be back here again. So I'm going to talk about air deportation. And I'll start, you know, sort of 3 points perhaps to contextualize my presentation. And the first, Alexandra already touched on, this is sort of part of a book project that's moving very slowly because there's a lot of friction, as is the way with the question or themes of transport. But the book, we're provisionally calling it Vehicles of Migration, Routes of Power. And there's 4 of us working on it. I'm working with Matt Coleman at Ohio, who's working on cars and traffic stops and deportations in the US, and Charles Heller and Lorenzo Pizzani, who are recent graduates of Goldsmiths, where they worked with Ilo Weitzman, and they're working on refugee boats in the Mediterranean. And we're trying to bring vehicles and mobilities more fully into migration studies, and at the same time trying to bring politics and power more fully into the study of mobilities. So that's and my chapter, my contribution to the project then will be about planes and deportations. But secondly, and sort of more immediately, this project comes out of my interest in modes of transportation, and particularly a feeling that of all, you know, the modes of movement, whether by car, train, bus, boat, the aeroplane is the least studied or the least researched or the least well understood, perhaps, in migration and border studies. I sort of have this feeling that there's a kind of curious blank spot concerning aviation. Now, there's certainly a lot of work on airports, a lot of really interesting work on airports and security and spaces of airports. But I feel that a lot of that work kind of stops at the gate, as it were. You know, it doesn't sort of follow, doesn't carry over into the plane as it takes off and the way it moves, and think about much about the aviation routes or a lot of the logistics of commercial aviation. So I really want to much bring that in to the study of migration, because it's kind of odd for me that the plane has flown under the radar. When you think how profoundly commercial aviation actually did transform migration and the way that people cross borders and cross oceans in the second half of the 20th century. You know, so that as commercial aviation took off in more than one sense, perhaps from the 1950s onwards, you know, we have a massive movement of people away from those networks that had previously taken them across, say, the Atlantic in steamships and various kind of liners, and onto commercial planes. And I think with that we see a sort of transformation of the whole phenomenology of migration. If you think sort of how the way in which migration was sort of symbolized and signified by, you know, images of ships and those sort of scenes of arrival and departure in great ports. You know, these things now only live on in immigration museums, like in Ellis Island here. And so there seems to be no equivalent for the plane. You know, we don't have that kind of phenomenology or that kind of iconology around aeroplanes. Aeroplanes have this kind of technological anonymity almost. That you know, planes, for example, typically don't have names, or at least I thought they didn't have names. But it turns out Lufthansa, you know, each Lufthansa plane carries the name of a particular German town. I think Virgin Airlines, because it likes to be a bit quirky, it also gives its planes names. But for the most part, a plane is just a number, you know. We don't typically remember. We might remember the kind of plane we drive. I remember coming to the United States on a jumbo jet. You know, I thought, that was really exciting. A Pan Am jumbo jet, there's no such thing anymore, right? But, you know, the plane didn't have a name. It was a rather anonymous experience. And I remember the experience very well. So I think we have strong and emotional memories and experiences of air travel, but within the public culture, the plane doesn't have anything like the place that it has, you know, the place that ships did. So I'm interested in bringing planes more generally into thinking about migration and border crossings. And I think the third reason that I'm interested in aviation networks has to do with the ordinary and the extraordinary. So I think that a lot of sort of migration and border studies, when it thinks about technologies, when it thinks about infrastructures, it's kind of drawn towards the sort of sexy or scary new technologies. You know, it's about drones, it's about databases, it's about scanners, it's about, you know, various cutting-edge forms of surveillance and control and identification. And you know, that's important. So a lot of, you know, research goes there because of the sort of ethics and the politics involved in those kind of experimental technologies. But I think it's strange for me that at the same time then here is aviation, which is this sort of very well established, very in some ways ordinary and mundane, I would argue, political technology, and it's sort of sitting there and it's doing a lot of this work, but it's not getting the kind of coverage that sort of the drone gets, for example. It seems kind of, you know, just ordinary. So I kind of want to open up the kind of black box, as it were, of commercial aviation. I'm not doing that in a general way today. I'm doing it through a specific angle, which is to think about the place that commercial aviation has, the relationship it has towards programs, tactics, policies, and politics of deportation. So my talk will be in 4 parts. Firstly, I'll very briefly talk about how migration and deportation studies has tended to overlook questions of transit and transport. Especially, I would say, deportation studies has not looked much at the actual conveyance of people. That's been a sort of missing bit in the middle, as it were. Secondly, I'll talk briefly about why I think it's useful to make connections to emerging literatures, sort of critical literatures on infrastructure, mobilities, and logistics. Thirdly, I'll set out 4 what I see issues and some concepts perhaps for thinking about and mapping and perhaps counter-mapping air deportation. And very lastly, I'll talk about problems of thinking about power and violence in the context of deportation, air deportation. So my general argument then is that, curiously, I think scholars of deportation, borders and security have mostly overlooked the moment of transport. So millions of people are deported on planes every year, but that sort of moment of the plane, the journey, is not as prominent as it might be in scholarship. Then I'll make a more specific argument, which is that states have a complex relationship to aviation in this domain. That it's a double-edged sword. Because I think on the one hand, you know, the availability, the presence, the phenomenon of a commercial aviation system gives deportation the kind of power, a capacity, it extends its scope and its scale and its speed and its flexibility. It brings all of that to expulsion projects. But at the same time, I argue, aviation is not a sort of neutral or passive instrument that states simply lay hold of and wield. You know, it's as though the state has formed a kind of Faustian bargain with aviation, and sort of the turn to aviation then introduces all sorts of contingencies, possibilities of reversals, possibilities and practices of resistance into the way that deportation is conducted, and I'll highlight those reversals as I proceed. So where are the missing vehicles when it comes to deportation studies? Quite often we see, certainly in media coverage and sometimes on the cover of books like this collection, one of the sort of early attempts to bring together a set of essays exploring politics and power of deportation. We see here prominently on the cover the Aeroplane we see a person in pink stiletto heels, I think sort of capturing the suddenness, perhaps, the seizure of people that occurs. But once we get into the book, the plane has more or less vanished. It sort of doesn't appear in the essays or in the studies. So I find this sort of absence or this missing element of transport peculiar in that context. I think it's also peculiar when we sort of think about forced mobility, banishment, expulsion, deportation in a historical context, because there is a very keen sense on the part of historians and cultural theorists that the ship and the train are sort of objects and sites and zones of struggle in their own right, that they merit their own histories. But again, I don't think we've yet really sort of arrived at that point when it comes to the study of deportation. Now, I say, that transport is missing, that vehicles are missing, but, I'm sort of overstating my argument for rhetorical effect there. So it's certainly the case that we've got work now where there is a sort of mention or a reflection, or the plane comes in and the routes come in. So in the UK, the work of Nick Gill, looking at detention, how people are moved around the UK's detention estate, not on planes typically, but buses. It's a small island state, the UK, and I'll be using the UK mostly for my case material in the discussion today, although I have some Canadian examples as well. But Gill makes this important point, as does Nancy Heemstra, from whom I borrowed this map, that one of the really important things about these movements, these circulations, is the way that they kind of, I think Nancy calls it a sort of chaotic geography, because it's sort of moving people around in unpredictable ways. And what's really significant about those movements is the way that they break up and disorient. They break up community ties. They break up the sort of networks that are really important to struggles over remaining a resident in countries. They break up sort of relationships to lawyers and to community supports, and they sort of render the individual more deportable, more vulnerable, more exposed by the fact of moving them around, keeping them in motion. And what I think is really important, and the reason I put this map up, and why it kind of really triggered something for me, is that I think we have this sort of, or at least we used to, and we still do in some ways, we have a sort of rather linear understanding of deportation in this sort of commonsensical way. We think of it as a sort of single sort of movement from country A to country B, a sort of violent, expulsive movement, like a straight line. And it's anything but a straight line. I think really it'd be more useful to sort of think in terms of deportation networks and to think about networks on many levels or many scales. So we have sort of transportation networks here that are, at the same time they're about breaking up social networks and support networks and networks of resistance. That we have networks on the sort of scale even within a country before in sort of producing a deportable person or community. But then, as I'll sort of argue, we also have networks when it comes to the actual movements between countries, and we have networks that mediate deportation. Because one thing I really have to stress, although I've sort of flagged the aeroplane in the title of my talk, deportation and aeroplanes and deportation, it's not about aeroplanes understood in any kind of isolated sense. I don't want to reify the aeroplane. The aeroplane is in some ways the visible tip of a much larger iceberg, that we have to think of all of the sort of the economies and the circulations of various objects, whether they are identification papers or whether it's the money that sometimes immigration authorities are paying to embassies to get papers to sort of smooth and facilitate a deportation. So we have to always think about these movements, these transits, within broader economies and ecologies in which money and various other types of objects are in motion. So I think that well, I'll be talking as we go along about deportation routes, but I think alongside routes we need to talk about corridors. You know, the corridors are sort of when routes become well insulated, as it were. You know, if you think about a corridor in a building, a corridor allows you to move quickly for a building, so you don't sort of get bogged down in what's going on in a particular room. Or if we think about corridors as economic spaces, you know, a lot of development thinking and economic theories about how can we build corridors that sort of promote enterprise, right? Corridors sort of cut through regulations and so on. So we can also, I think, talk about deportation corridors, to borrow a term from Hasselberg and Dropbom in recent publication of theirs. So I'm going to sort of add to this idea, I hope, of deportation corridors as we go along. And to think about when routes become corridors, under what conditions do they become corridors. So that's to mention some works that are already contributing to our understanding of air deportation. Another, I think, important field of work has been done by people like Liz Fakete in the UK at the Institute for Race Relations, and sort of campaign groups like Corporate Watch, who are actually, you know, they're doing the necessary work of documenting what's happening on planes. So they're sort of identifying the plane as a space of human rights violations. They're identifying the plane and the aviation network as a space of secrecy, and sort of calling for greater public attention and political and legal intervention in these spheres. So there's certainly been a very important activist and interventionist knowledge generated about flights, which I'm really indebted to in carrying this work forward. But the way in which I want to carry it forward is by making connections then to emerging literatures or sort of critical studies of networks, infrastructure and logistics. Because I don't think these connections have been made yet, but I think they could be very fruitful. So there's sort of, I give 3 examples of how this is useful and how this move sort of informs what I'm trying to do. And firstly, sort of actor network theory, a very sort of well-known, well-established body of work with a particular take on networks. I'm not sort of going to talk about actor network theory in general here, but you know, just briefly three points that I take from it that I think are really useful for the work that I'm interested in. The first is that networks, you know, so there's transportation network like a motorway network, highway network, you know, they don't just sort of sit there. They have to be built, but they have to be repaired, they have to be maintained. They're susceptible to all sorts of, you know, a particular material that's in the road might crumble in an unexpected way and needs to be fixed, or you might have an accident that needs to be managed or worked around. So networks are sort of keep you busy, you know, they don't just sort of sit there. They have to be maintained, they have to be managed, they have to be worked around. Secondly, what I take from actor network theory is a sort of methodological point, which is that, you know, a lot of times these networks are rather kind of incredibly ordinary and prosaic, and we barely notice them. You know, they're kind of invisible, or they're kind of almost like hidden in plain sight, right? And we only notice them when they break down, when something happens. So, you know, I think an important methodological lesson from actor network theory is it's when you have an accident, when you have an incident, when you have a controversy, this is a sort of valuable research site. Because, you know, when some infrastructure breaks down, when a train crashes, you know, you might have a public inquiry. And in that public inquiry, you know, all sorts of experts now come forward and talk about the materials that the rails are made out of, the sort of regulations governing the people who drive the train, etc., etc. So all of that kind of very ordinary infrastructural stuff becomes put into discourse. It gets talked about, and it affords you this opportunity to sort of study it in kind of rich detail. So I've taken, you know, in the study of say air deportation, then, you know, there's all sorts of incidents. You know, for example, an Irish plane that's trying to deport people to Nigeria, but it's refused permission to fly over Algeria. What does that tell you? Well, immediately it raises the question that airspace, you know, the governance of airspace features in the production of deportation routes, something that we hadn't really thought about. You know, we don't think about airspace as having much to do with the governance of migration, but clearly it does. So in these incidents, that, you know, as and when they're reported in public, one can find ways into the study and understanding the power relations at work in these rather grey and otherwise anonymous networks. And then lastly, I would say, sort of carrying on from that, the actor network theory encourages us to think about hybrids and very heterogeneous things. Again, we don't think of jaws, the jaws having much to do with migration control. Who thinks that jaws have anything to do with migration control? But I'll come to this slide later where, when the UK starts to rethink how its privately employed escorts, as they're called, security personnel, are supposed to apply force to migrants who are resisting deportation. They come up with a list of 12 recommended, if you like, means of applying force, means of applying violence. And one of these recommended is what's called the mandibular angle technique, which is to sort of push a finger into someone's, behind their jaw right there. So clearly you can see that the jaw, and there's a sort of set of scientific research around all of these techniques, that the jaw as a sort of object and as a sort of calculated site of applying pain has a place somewhere in this broader economy of force that kind of surrounds and informs and invests the conduct or the carrying out of deportations. Who would have thought that the jaw has a place in this? But it does, and so I think we need to think. So a lot of time, political scientists, they have a very, a rather sort of, I would say, blinkered, or they sort of want to. It's not just political science, but let's draw boundaries. We study political institutions. We study interests, values, actors. We don't study jaws. We don't study satellites. Engineers study satellites. Biologists and anatomists study jaws. But, an important lesson of actor network theory is we need to cut across those boundaries and study the peculiar networks and combinations that bring sort of politics into some sort of relation, politics and ethics into a relationship with the jaw. So that's what I take from actor network theory, and I'll flesh some of that out as we go along. A sort of second area of work, mobility studies, and sort of John Urry, think of him as a sort of godfather or founding father of some kind, very patriarchal way of mobility studies. And I think one of the points Urry makes is very important is, mobility is not this generic thing. We have to think about different systems, as he calls them. Different mobility systems. What are the qualities, the properties, the affordances of these different systems? If you think about, you compare, say, aviation, commercial air travel with bus travel, right? Buses have drivers. Sometimes they have conductors. When I was a kid in London, buses had conductors as well as drivers. And the conductor was a kind of authority figure, He or she was checking your tickets, but also maintaining a certain kind of order on the bus. Although the bus I used to take to sort of South London, that they would kind of abandon the top deck of the bus on a Saturday night. It was like, wild zone, the conductor is not going up there, So if you want to sort of join in the party, you go on the top floor of the bus. If you want a sort of quiet ride, you sit on the bottom. But that's all to say that the bus has a particular kind of set of authority relations attached to it, but they're relatively weak authority relations. When you sort of move to airlines, the captain of the plane, just like the captain of a ship, is a really strong authority figure. And, the captains have this sort of special power. And this special power, which is rooted in their responsibility for the life and security of an entire vessel when it's, thousands of miles at sea or when it's thousands of feet in the air. They have that kind of life and death power almost. They become sort of quasi-sovereign figures. And again, this makes a difference to the way that deportation happens. Because deportation, once it starts to be channeled through these aviation networks, means that it's coming into contact with pilots and crews. It has to come into contact with them. And then that sets up interference, it sets up entanglement, it sets up situations where that power of the captain to sort of decide that a flight is not going to take off because the flight is not safe, the captain is called upon. The responsibility of the captain can be invoked by migrants or by their allies. And we have plenty of incidents where captains have refused to fly particular planes because they've heeded the call of a particular migrant that they are being sort of forcibly deported, and that this, they're making a fuss or they're certainly refusing to go quietly, and the captains say, okay, no, I'm not going to fly. But then we also have the workarounds, the ways in which lots of captains avoid exercising that responsibility, avoid exercising that right, and fly the planes regardless of what is being done to some of the people on board those planes. So that's to say then that mobility systems and their properties and their regimes of authority and their norms and their qualities and their affordances make a difference. And even within aviation, we see there are different types of aviation system. So one of the big differences when it comes to air deportation is the difference between, on the one hand, putting 1, 2, 3 deportees on a commercial flight with regular passengers versus this practice that's becoming that's very prominent in Europe, and the United States has its own version of it, which is the sort of charter flight, where the entire plane is given over to deportees plus the security personnel and the medical personnel. So those are different aviation systems with different qualities, and I'll come back to that. And then the third kind of thing I take from this interesting literature on infrastructure from New York's own Timothy Mitchell. And there's a very nice section in this Carbon Democracy book where he's talking about the fact that when you have coal was moving along very narrow channels. It was moving along railways. It was moving along canals into ports. So you had this sort of immense concentration of energy and wealth moving in these narrow channels, which exposed that network, if you like, to certain forms of strategic action on the part of workers once they became organised. Once they learned tactics of sabotage and unionism, it became possible to interrupt and to enhance their kind of power through the kind of leverage they could wield over these networks, precisely because the channels are narrow. And he says, as the carbon economy shifts towards oil moves in very different ways from coal. The fact that, for example, it's moving on large tankers. Tankers have this kind of fluidity of movement which coal never had in the same way. So it's harder in some ways to use those tactics in an oil-based economy. And he draws correlations between then these networks, these infrastructures, and the possibilities for political organisation. So again, I think this is another feature of commercial aviation. Aviation is a narrow channel, and it has particular ways in which it gets blocked or obstructed. It's also interesting because it's a very delicate ecology. Commercial aviation is not moving coal, it's moving people. It's moving people who, a lot of times, have paid a lot of money for these tickets, and they get really pissed off when the plane gets delayed, right? You can't move them around like coal because they complain, right? So, migrants, again, they have what Brett Nielsen, who writes about logistics, calls strategic position. And there are different levels with which you understand that you occupy a strategic position. But a strategic position means you're in a network and you have some kind of awareness that you have a capacity for disruption, and that disruption can cascade. So again, disrupting commercial airlines has proved a sort of cascading effect that has exerted a certain power, certain leverage over air deportation. So those are the kind of literatures that I'm drawing on primarily. There's a second sort of field of literature. I'm not going to talk about it in any detail, but I think it's also important to bring into the question of air deportation. And I look to thinkers like Elias Canetti in Crowds and Power, Foucault in Discipline and Punish, Arendt in Eichmann in Jerusalem, Shamayer's recent work on manhunts, Ravil Netz's work on barbed wire. All of them are sort of thinking about power as, as and when it takes hold of bodies. They're sort of thinking about what it means to seize a body, the way in which, say, secrecy and the power of surprise. Canetti gives you a natural history of secrecy in Crowds and Power, where it's the power to sort of conceal and then to sort of jump on a prey and to sort of immobilise and to terrorise it. And I think those thinkers and those ways of understanding power in a very corporeal way are very important in this work. Because, one of the problems of actor network theory is developed as it was as a sort of anthropology of laboratory life and techno-scientific research. It didn't have a whole lot of, Latour's didn't develop a whole lot of concepts to think about, bodies being seized and banished or anything like that. It was completely off the map. So when people sort of take actor network theory and bring it into, say, security studies, as has been the trend in recent years, I think that needs to be borne in mind, that we need other additional critical tools if we're to do a good job there. So I've got that in the background too. So what is air deportation? I'm using the concept really to name, because one of the curious things is that deportation can the word can apply to a very broad phenomenon, as can the concept like deportability. But do we have a word then for the sort of actual transport part of it? So I kind of want to identify and name the transport part, the transit moment, which I stress is one moment, one element in a much broader field of relationship. I noticed that deportation sort of dropped out. Another actor network theory point there, that the networks will always sort of mess you about and behave in unexpected and unpredictable ways. So the word deportation has dropped out of its little white box there. So I want to kind of name a concept for this space in the middle. I want to sort of move away from a sort of generic conception of deportation as a movement of bodies to sort of say, well, we talk about boat migration today, and of course the term is very problematic in all sorts of ways, but nevertheless a notion like boat migration recognises that the sea and boats and borders and coasts all make a difference and have to be sort of dealt with and politicised and depoliticised in different ways. So likewise, I think we should move to a more contextualised and materially enriched understanding of deportation. So that's one reason I'm talking about air deportation. I'm also doing what I see as a sort of a counter mapping of it, because on the one hand I don't want to. It's not as though in alluding to boat migration, I'm not sort of saying, oh, well, we want a similar spectacle, a similar pornography, visual pornography of deportation. So I think it has to be approached very carefully. So, for example, I'm using this image here from a short film that James Bridle, a UK multimedia artist and activist, has made. It's called Seamless Transitions. And, what it depicts, it's a computer-generated image of this kind of gate at Stansted Airport just outside London. And by day, this is where VIPs and celebrities and politicians are getting onto private jets. By night, the same kind of architecture, precisely because it's about moving people quietly and undercover, is used for charter flights and deportations. Now it's very significant that this is a computer-generated image, because Bridle is not allowed to photograph this place. It's securitized. I remember when I travelled in the Soviet Union in the 80s, we were told, don't photograph that bridge. I mean, I've always loved bridges and trains, and so I wanted to photograph this infrastructure. No, you can't photograph it, it's highly sensitive. And you thought, how could a bridge be sensitive? But here, lo and behold, you can't take a photo of various parts of airports. So the very fact that he had to reconstruct this space from dimensions and measurements and plans is telling in itself about this phenomenon, I think, of air deportation. So there's a kind of counter-mapping, and I'll come to some other forms of counter-mapping as we go along. So I want to talk about 4 issues, and perhaps I'll see if I've got time to do 4. But the first I want to talk about the speed. I think speed is really significant. If you look at here's the UK's top 10 nationalities in 2013 in terms of numbers of deportations. And again, if we conduct a little experiment of the kind of thought experiment, Latour says, if you really want to know what difference a device or an artifact makes, take it out of the picture and then ask how it would work. So he says, in his very nice paper, The Sociology of a Door Closer, the pressurized thing that closes the door. He says, if the door closer wasn't there, what would you have to do? Well, you'd either have those people with the scrambled egg on their shoulders, like you have on the Upper East Side here, standing by doors, and you'd be employing them, or you'd be sticking signs on the door, please close the door. You'd then have to worry about translating the sign into other languages. You'd have all sorts of work that you would have to do to make sure that door opens and closes reliably. So you can see that the door closer is doing a lot of work. It's active. And on a larger scale, and perhaps less playfully, we could say, well, if we took the plane out of the picture, what would deportation look like? And you think, what would it take to send nearly 10,000 people from the UK to India in a given year, or to Pakistan? on boats or over land. It would require, extremely long journeys with a great deal of discomfort, a massive sort of exercise in repression. Now, I'm not saying that planes are not repressive. They are, they require a large exercise of repressive force. But planes are relatively quick. So it changes the whole economy of force. I think those sorts of ship-based or land-based deportations on that sort of scale and distance would kind of not be acceptable, at least under present circumstances, to liberal democratic publics. Now, of course, we've seen boat deportations going on in Europe just this week. Those are relatively short journeys between Greece and Turkey. So the plane then makes a big difference at this level in terms of the amount of force and repression you need to exercise. So, I want to argue throughout my presentation that the plane makes a difference. It's not just a sort of neutral instrument. It actually shapes deportation. It's not, it's not just incidental. It makes deportation in its modern form. It constitutes it in various ways. So the speed and the space-time of the journey is very significant. It changes the economy of force. Secondly, I want to talk about deportation routes and networks, and to develop that point that I made a bit earlier. Does anyone recognise what this kind of image is about? Yes?
Is it the internet?
No, it's not the internet, it's a different net.
Is the map of Europe the flights?
Yes, it's the flights over Europe. So that's the UK there, just above the letter U, sort of triangular-shaped object, sort of a glow around Heathrow and Gatwick and Stansted. So those are the airline paths, and this is produced by NATS that wants to sort of glamorise and sex up aviation because it's in the business of controlling aviation routes. But when we see a plane take off, this is kind of invisible. Planes are a bit different from, when we're on a train we can see the tracks, when we're in a car we can see the roads, but we don't see the routes, but the routes are there, they're very tangible. It's taken a lot of work to produce those routes, to regulate them, to control them. Now, but this is very significant for deportation, because if you're a country like Ireland, and sort of Ireland is not lit up that much, but Ireland, the top of the Irish deportation charts is Nigeria. So half of Ireland's deportees are going to Nigeria. But there's no direct flights from from Dublin to Lagos. So how does Ireland deport people by plane? Well, it has to then go through London, or it has to go through Amsterdam, or through Vienna. And this immediately raises sorts of problems, logistical and political and legal problems, because, we're talking about putting 2 or 3 people on a flight and they're accompanied by these security personnel. And the typical ratio is about 3 security guards or escorts to 1 deportee. But what kind of power, what kind of jurisdiction applies when that Irish security guard is in Heathrow Airport or in Frankfurt or in Vienna? So what is their kind of workaround? Well, their workaround then is to sort of liaise with their corresponding sometimes they're called airline liaison officers. So they need to connect with their British, German, Austrian partners in those airports. They need to ensure that their partners are there at the very moment that the gates or the doors of the plane open, because they don't have a kind of right to exercise violent force over the deportee when they're in an airport in another country, in a third country, in a transit place. So this question of transit, this question of hubs, has become really sort of significant, and we see it in the European Union, especially where it's produced directives, and Frontex, the border control agency, has been engaged in a whole sort of activities to sort of try to regulate transit, to try to solve this problem of the sort of potential leakiness of hubs and changeover places where migrants can either escape or make asylum claims. So they need to kind of seal those spaces, they need to control them, and the directives specify all sorts of things such as, all the relevant airports should have secure zones where people can be detained, and that these connections have to be established. So these are networks again. These are not just the transport networks, but we see how the transport networks, their geography, their distribution, in turn generates networks of security, networks of expertise, networks of deportation and migration professionals. And this is, of course, all in turn accentuated by the way in which aviation systems transformed since the 1970s, beginning in the United States, where under deregulation the airlines shifted from what they called the model of direct routes to the hub and spoke model. The hub and spoke model gives you Atlanta, right? Atlanta is the most hubby networked airport in the world because it's a sort of major hub. So you're less likely to fly from A to B, you're more likely to fly from A to Atlanta and then to B, because it works out that that's much more economical for airlines. But what it means is there's more and more changing planes involved, and that poses significant problems then for the carrying out of deportation. And it's another way in which, you know, there's all this stuff in the middle. There's not a simple flight or movement or flow of people from country A to country B. There's all this stuff going on in the middle, all this sort of material and political and power stuff in the middle that we have to sort of get to grips with. It's about the irreducibility, I would argue, of transport and transit. Here's another example of, you know, in some ways this captures the sort of scale of this kind of power. This concerns a particular man, Saeed Jama, who was deported from Canada to Somalia. And it's, again, you sort of, when you start to map it, and I've mapped, you know, I produced this map using a very sort of simple online tool. And I think that, you know, I think of this as a sort of counter mapping, because we see everywhere these maps by which migrants are said to be coming into Europe or the United States or Canada. So always the lines cross the borders and bring people in. We rarely see mapped these other movements. You know, deportation then has a certain kind of invisibility. It's not sort of unpacked. So, you know, we can think about it in a sort of counter mapping and what we can learn from carrying out this kind of exercise. And this is what I would call an extreme case, this particular case that came to prominence in Canada. It's extreme in the sense that Canada is deporting people to Somalia, but at the same time the Canadian government says it's not safe for us to send our own migration officials or our own airlines to Somalia, but it's safe enough to send this man, or not just this man, but there's been a number of these cases. So what happens is that the Canadian officials and escorts take the guy through Amsterdam and then into Nairobi, and then he's handed off to a private company called Loss Prevention International. Handed over $25,000 in cash. You know, any time that people are handing over that kind of amount of money in cash, you know something a bit fishy is going on. And then he's flown by a different, you know, a kind of grey economy into Mogadishu. And what I found, one of the things that became interesting from doing this mapping was there was another case, a man called Wasama, who was sent along the same route, but in Amsterdam, when they were changing planes, he was able to sort of get the attention of Dutch immigration officials, who initially, he said, you know, wanted to kind of ignore him, and their Canadian counterparts were saying, you know, it's okay, we're in control of everything. But he kind of successfully managed to get the attention of these officials and to protest that he was being forcibly moved. And he was eventually able to lodge an asylum claim in the Netherlands. So it shows you again that these routes can be broken down, that there are these sort of these joints where things don't necessarily play out, where reversals are possible. Thirdly, I want to talk about, to sort of really focus on, I guess, the microphysics of the plane. And this is another part of the work around how you deal with the problem of transit, how you deal with the problem of hubs. This image comes from a very important study that was published in the German paper Die Zeit, where they tried to map each Frontex organised charter flight. And these are the charter flights. They're joint operations, so they're taking deportees from a number of different European countries and combining them. This particular flight goes from Rotterdam to Madrid to Lagos. And it's like a sort of school bus, sort of deportation school bus, which is not, and I don't mean to trivialize it in any way, because there's something about a school bus, right? That all vehicles, like to move, we have to be enveloped, right? To move at any sort of speed, we humans require some kind of envelope, some kind of sphere, and vehicles provide that kind of envelope, that sphere. And you know, the faster we move and the higher up we move, the more important that sphere or containment becomes. So the containment part of the vehicle or the vessel is a necessary part or condition, a material aspect of movement, but it also means, you know, that confinement can work in other ways. You know, we can have an experience where a train might stop, and soon we realise that we're confined in that train. Suddenly we realise the confining properties or qualities of trains. And in this particular case, the confining properties of the plane are being put to strategic use. Because what this plane does then, it loads up, you know, half of its deportees are loaded in Rotterdam, and then they wait in the plane in Madrid. So again, it seals them in. There's that problem of how you manage people in transit is worked around by the fact that the plane then becomes like a sort of temporary detention centre sitting there in the airport in Madrid for 2 hours while the next groups are loaded, and then it flies on to Lagos. So we have to sort of take seriously then the very material form and the role that these vehicles actually play. They're not sort of neutral, passive instruments or mere transport forms. They actually become sort of confining, detaining zones and moving materials in their own right. And the same thing could be said about buses. For a lot of these deportations to take place, you need to move people from various detention centres or holding places by buses, typically, to planes and to airports. And sometimes people can spend, you know, there are reports of people spending 7 or 8 hours in one of these airport buses. So the bus becomes a particularly uncomfortable and nasty confining space. In many ways, nastier than the plane itself. Very lastly, then, I want to talk about interference. And I've already sort of touched on this point, but you know, this is a theme that comes up from reading some of the material that's been produced by activist and campaign movements and the various discussions I've had with people working in these campaigns and discussions I've had with journalists working on these issues. And it's about, you know, the potential for invoking the captain and the crew and getting them to sort of intervene in what's happening. And it's about invoking the sort of legal powers and responsibilities that captains have. It's not only about captains and crews, because it's also in the case of when deportees are on scheduled flights, making certain appeals to passengers as well. And we've seen a number of instances where passengers have been kind of mobilised. And it's quite fascinating, you know, going back to the theme of the qualities and the properties and the affordances of different transport systems. You know, the plane is one of the places like the car where you have to be strapped in. You have to have a seatbelt. Without a seatbelt, you don't take off, right? Because it's a very fast takeoff. It's potentially turbulent. And so there have been a number of cases where passengers, to prevent a deportation happening, have refused to do their seatbelts up. So I find it fascinating that you know, because of the particular structure, if you like, or network that we're dealing with, something that seems as relatively simple as not doing your seatbelt up could actually make a difference. Now, of course, we still have the question of why, in most cases, passengers don't mobilise. You know, these are the exceptions rather than the norm. You know, although it might seem relatively simple not to do your seatbelt up, most of the time people go along with it, and that's a very complicated question as to why they go along with it. But you know, there's a number of factors involved. You know, when we're flying, when we're in airports, we often feel quite uneasy. You know, we're told that what will happen to us if we defy these sort of aviation regulations? Will we be hauled off the plane? Where will we end up if we're sort of taken off the plane in this sort of airport that we know nothing about in a third country? Or there's the way in which the the security personnel tried to manage these situations. So one of the most prominent and controversial situations occurred in the UK in 2010 when a man called Jimmy Mabenga died at the hands of the G4S security personnel on a flight that was about to leave London for Uganda. And because of that death, because it then provoked a coroner's inquiry and a public inquiry, then a whole load of the mechanics and the mechanisms and the cultural practices that surrounded the deportation flight were kind of brought into the public domain. So it provided a kind of glimpse into how these things were done. And so we heard precisely how the security personnel had told the airline crew not to get involved. They would say, look, these people always make a fuss, they always kick off when the plane's on the taxiing on the runway, but once it's in the air, they'll quieten down. So just kind of leave it to us. So this airline crew just sort of stood back and let this what turned out to be a murder play out. And similarly with the passengers. Passengers, these are the experts. We'll kind of keep our distance. So there are these dynamics at work and the way that they're worked in these particular situations. I've sort of run out of time, so I'm not going to talk about the art of removal, but I'll put it out there in case anyone wants to sort of raise it as a question, which is, here is a sort of an important study by Corporate Watch into the kind of economy of these charter flights. And they're using this highly sort of potent and I would say controversial image that's drawn from the slave ship Brooks as part of the abolitionist campaign in the 1780s. And I would argue that there's all sorts of ways it might be a necessary polemical intervention in the public sphere, but there's all sorts of ways in which the slave ship is not in any way an adequate model or concept for understanding the kind of economy of force, the economy of violence, and the economy of care as well, that all sort of circulates and structures and organises the flight. So I'd be happy to talk about the relationship between, say, voluntary departure and if enforced or escorted departures in question times, and to talk about this theme of political anatomy, which I touched on, number 7, the mandibular angle technique. And very finally, I would talk about air power, in case anyone's interested. I think we need an expanded understanding of air power. Air power we kind of think of as a military thing. It's measured by how many bombers, how many missiles, how many planes you have. International relations people love air power. But I think we need an expanded notion of air power to try to make sense of some of the phenomena that I've been talking about. Okay, so I've gone on for 50 minutes, so I'll call a stop there.
Fascinating. And I'll open you up for questions, comments from the audience. The microphone's right there. If you can introduce yourself, that'd be helpful.
I am.
It's on yet. It is?
No. Anyway, I'm Ed Wilcox. Thanks for a very interesting talk. And I was just curious, I like this idea of networks and tracing the infrastructures and material discursive processes that exist throughout. And I'm just wondering, can you say a little bit about how, let's say, a network of deportation or a corridor, or whatever you want to call it, might connect to other kind of networks of control that are, let's say, border enforcement,
yeah.
or are they kind of compartmentalized in a way? And if so, like, where are the spaces that they come together? I mean, Frontex, you mentioned, I think, is one European case.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that, again, we have these kind of now quite detailed and thick and descriptive and theoretical accounts of, say, migration and border control. So we no longer think of the border as a line. Sort of think of it as a zone, we think about it as a geography, as a distributed space that involves various kinds of, say, detention centres or zones in airports and various kinds of technologies of surveillance and various kinds of personnel. So we have the sort of sociology and anthropology of borders in the context of migrations, but it's nearly always comes up, in the context of flows kind of coming into a country. We're sort of seeing it from the perspective of Europeans or North Americans and how our borders are being policed. But there's a sort of, in some ways, the same infrastructure and sometimes the same personnel is relevant to these movements that are going in the other direction. And again, it's not a one-way direction, as we have, as we were talking about earlier. these are sometimes circuits, you're deported and you come back, and it's a sort of complex economy of movement. But something like the way in which the airport, then the management of the airport in the context of removing people, there's a sort of complexity and a density to that it involves networks of liaisons. It might, I don't know yet, the empirical thing to work out, is it the same rooms? Are the same rooms in the airport used to hold people that are being deported as that are being used to sort of take, when someone's taken off a plane because they're suspected because of their documents and so on. So, yeah, it's about providing a sort of thick account of that infrastructure, I would say. Because what's happened, I think, is that, again, deportation has been somewhat bracketed from the study of borders and migration. It's seen as a sort of separate thing, as it were. But, when we do these sort of mapping exercises, we can sort of see that these phenomena need to be sort of placed on the same level in some ways, I would argue.
Yes, thanks a lot, Professor Carlos. Now, I found this very fascinating. I was just wondering whether you could say a bit more about the practices of resistance, because the examples that you mentioned, in some sense, they seem rather limited.
Yeah.
You point to individuals on planes who don't fasten their seatbelt, or maybe already, before boarding start to cause trouble, as it were. And as you pointed out, it's not really clear what happens afterwards. Often they just also have to leave the plane. If they manage for the deportee to be taken off the plane. But then what happens to the deportee? Her situation is usually not resolved by this. Right? There are some cases where it leads to reconsideration of their asylum claims, for example. In many cases, it doesn't. They just get another flight somewhat later, or even more organized campaigns like the Lufthansa deportation class campaign, which in a way forced Lufthansa to officially stop participating in deportations organized by the German state. In the end, Lufthansa just shifted the business to subsidiaries, as far as I know. So again, quite, it was a huge success in the public eye, but it was quite limited in some ways. So is there other forms of resistance that go further than this kind of surface irritation that these examples seem to cause? And in some ways one might suspect that there must be, because if it's true that we have here forms of network infrastructure that are so essential, then these infrastructures must also be vulnerable to forms of sabotage, etc., that would interrupt them in specific instances. But at the same time, it seems so hard to do that. So I was wondering.
And I think that's a really good question. It's something I've sort of thought over many times. The first thing I would say is that I think it's important to recognize that these irritations or obstructions that have been accomplished by either migrants and or allies or passengers have a constitutive force. So it's quite often the case that the person who avoids or prevents or resists deportation, then gets placed into a higher risk category, so that typically, they might end up on a charter plane because they've now been identified as somebody who is difficult to place on a scheduled commercial flight. So it's true that as individuals, but this is the nature of social struggles a lot of the time. That a struggle can change things, although the particular people involved in that struggle, they might not might not benefit directly from the things that they've helped to change or bring about. Now, in this case, the change is not, maybe it's not a very progressive change. We could say that because of all of these resistances and disturbances that really started to gain momentum in the early 2000s, that partly explains why this new aviation system of charter flights comes into being. So, the politicians and the policymakers will often make reference to this problem of people disrupting commercial flights as one of the reasons why they're now turning to charters. So it's important, though, to recognise then that social struggles and contestations have changed the geography and the mechanisms of deportation, although we might say not in a very progressive direction. Because one of the things about the charter flight is, of course, that there are no passengers' eyes. There are no witnesses. There are no civilian witnesses on that plane. The plane is only the deportees and the security personnel and the medical personnel. And some monitors, though. So, I mean, I had this slide gone to... Go back to play. I had a slide about monitoring. And I think monitoring is very interesting. Because, you know, as charter flights have become more routinized and become a sort of normal part of the deportation infrastructure, we've seen movements from various directions in civil society, you know, calling for a routine monitoring by various types of inspectors and experts of these flights, you know. So when I presented this paper or version of this in Switzerland, you know, I had as a discussant the sort of leading Swiss lawyer of Swiss monitoring, and he said, well, what's the problem? You know, Switzerland has the best monitoring. We monitor every flight. And then people in the audience, I mean, I'm not an expert on Switzerland, people in the audience and on the panel saying, yeah, but we also have the most brutal police when it comes to the deportation of people from Switzerland. So it was fascinating and troubling that transparency and violence, you know, rather than being a zero-sum relationship in the Swiss case, you know, it's actually transparency seems to legitimate greater violence. But my broader point, I guess, about monitoring is that, you know, we might react to it and say, well, you know, monitoring is just a kind of legitimation of a really nasty exercise, and it doesn't accomplish much. But I would not dismiss monitoring. You know, one might compare it to, say, factory inspection in the 19th century. You know, the factory begins as this closed-off private space under capitalism, this new space where all sorts of violences and depredations occur. And then, you know, through various kinds of social struggles, not necessarily directly, you have the rise of the factory inspector, which is part of a kind of growth of a regulation and a taming, if you like, of the factory space. Now, of course, if you're a sort of revolutionary, you're going to say, well, that didn't really help, did it? You know, it gets us back to the old reform versus revolution debate. But I think there's something to be said for thinking about deportation along those lines, because I think when these charter flights and these deportations really sort of took off, they were in some ways wild spaces, and that we're seeing the potential for a kind of taming of them. And again, if we're radicals and we say no deportation, no nation sort of thing, which, you know, a lot of us might sympathise with that desire, that political principle. But the fact is, you know, it seems that we're stuck with deportations in the near future. So the question is, you know, what do we do about it? Do we just sort of oppose them in principle? Or do we sort of think about how can these spaces, these phenomena, these practices be tamed and sort of how can a certain amount of rights be brought into this sphere? So I'll give you a good example. In this report, in this very report that was of the flight that I showed you from Rotterdam to Madrid to Lagos, it's a very interesting report. And one of the points it makes is, well, here's a flight. It takes the whole thing takes about 10 hours, and we can say, well, that's quite quick. You know, set within the broader landscape, time space of deportation, it's quite quick. But we have to remember that leading up to that deportation, you know, campaign activity typically becomes more and more frenzied, so that every minute counts. Right, the clock really is counting. It's a sort of countdown to the takeoff of the plane. So what the report makes is a quite reasonable and I think important point, is that, well, at the moment the practice is to take the phones and all the possessions off the deportees when they get on the plane, and they only get them at the other end. They're saying, well, in that 10 hours in flight, a successful appeal might have happened back in the Netherlands, right? So that there should be a right, or a standard, or a norm, if you like, that the deportee gets to sort of make a phone call before getting off the plane. So my friend, you know, my friend Alison Mance talks about the long tunnel thesis, where Canada, you know, as part of its immigration enforcement at its borders, says, you know, you're in Canada, but you're not really in Canada yet. There's this sort of long tunnel at the port of entry, and they do that to sort of lessen rights, to lessen access, and to make migrants more vulnerable. But the opposite can be worked as well, where we have a sort of long border at the other end, where you might actually be on the ground in the plane in Lagos, but if you can show that your appeal has been successful, then you can go back. So, what I'm saying is then that monitoring and these questions of talking about actual improvements in terms of norms and standards and technical things can make a difference. And that maybe we should be thinking about these rights and norms and standards in relation to the whole time space of transit as well. That's to try to give it a more hopeful spin.
Yes, we only have to talk very close.
So you mentioned the person's being transported, and at the end of the trip, there's some sort of monetary exchange. This mysterious monetary exchange.
Yes.
So I was wondering if there's a business element to this, kind of like the for-profit prison system in the US.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. See, I think the notion of a migration industry has become a sort of important and commonly used concept now when people talk about migration control. It's important because it means we're not thinking about migration control as just a relationship between states and migrants, but there is a whole, in as much as there is an infrastructure, that infrastructure requires money, it requires maintenance, it requires personnel, it's an economy. So, a lot of times the concept of migration industry sort of highlights, well, there's something not nice about this, that certain people, businesses, companies are making money out of misery, making money out of repression. They're profiting from it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. But again, I think that concept is a bit limited when we look at deportation. So in the case, Virgin Airlines, for example, runs daily flights from London to Jamaica. And a lot of times there'll be deportees on those planes. But Virgin Airlines doesn't need, this is what journalists told us, that Virgin Airlines can sell those seats to regular customers. It doesn't need deportation, as a business. In fact, it would rather not be doing this. So we have to sort of see both sides. That certainly there are various actors and companies and industries that do provide specialised services like G4S, Wacken Hut, Loss Prevention International. They make money out of providing these specialised services. But there's also lots of situations where airlines don't want to be deporting people. Going back to this point about campaigns, Lufthansa didn't like what happened to its brand image once it became associated with this activity. So campaigners were very savvy because they could see that, an airline is a brand, right? Especially a large national carrier is a brand. It's very prominent, and it's spent billions of dollars to foster the association between Lufthansa and or United Air and sunny destinations and happiness and leisure and speed and freedom and mobility. So there's a sort of vulnerability. This going back to what I was saying about the properties of different systems of mobility. These are commercial systems, and they don't want their brand associated with nasty things. So that became a point of leverage. And we've had other cases where airlines have backed away from it. But when I highlighted this moment here in Nairobi, that's a case where, and I call it an extreme case, because it's a case where we get into this grey area. And I say it's extreme because I'm not arguing that all deportations, air deportations, involve something that looks like people smuggling. This is an extreme case where it does look like people smuggling, where you're paying cash to a rather shady outfit who then basically take the migrant off your hands, right? It's an extreme case in that respect, but it shows you again that to understand these networks, we have to see that that there are what we might think of as regular and standardized practices, but then there are also grey areas and possibly illegal activities as well. One thing I would say also, just in passing, I did some work about 6 years ago on stowaways. The sort of classic stowaways, where the 2 or 3 people who get on a boat on a large ship secretly and then travel on it. And one of the things I found really fascinating was that that then presents the shipping company with the problem if the stowaway is found, because typically the ports don't want the stowaway. It's your problem, not ours. So they're stuck on the boat, stuck on the ship. And so the insurance companies, it turns out, become they have this expertise, this practice, this way of getting rid of stowaways. And so there are these, again, all these subcontractors who are like fixers based in different ports, who, you know, the large respectable insurance companies, in maritime insurance companies, they're some of the oldest insurance companies in the world, in London, in Oslo, in Amsterdam. They then subcontract to these sort of specialised loss prevention experts, as they're called, who sort out, they get papers or they bribe people and they get them off the ships. And it's a similar company, it seems, in some cases, working these cases too. So there are these experts in sort of people removal, if you like. It would be a really sort of fascinating and scary area to sort of study. And, you know, I've been talking to various documentary makers who are really interested in that kind of, that node, if you like, within these larger systems of mobility and commerce.
Can you tell a little bit more about air power?
Yes.
And the relationship between, because I think it's not because you've been talking about commercial aviation and how that relates to perhaps military logistics or air power in general.
Yeah. Well, with air power, yeah, this is something I haven't, you know, formulated very at all satisfactorily. But, you know, typically air power is a sort of commonly used concept, you know, in security studies and international relations and in the military. You know, we think of air power as it's also like a metric of air force, how many bombers and missiles you can mobilise. But I think we need a sort of expanded understanding of air power, you know, and maybe Foucault gives us one way to sort of think about this expanded notion of air power. So my expanded notion of air power would not be confined to the military. It would sort of, for example, recognise that if aviation can become a political technology, it's a political technology because it's involved, in Foucault's sense, in the government of population. It's involved in the ordering of the world population, right? In a number of senses. It actually facilitates the distribution of people across borders. It actually involves governing a whole city that at any one time is in the air, right? So at any one time on Earth, 500,000 people are in the air, and they're being governed. And so it's really interesting to think about the sort of regimes of authority, the practices, you know, the way that captains and crews and airlines and aviation companies and navigation controls all kind of contribute to that governing of 500,000 people who are at any one time suspended, or just as you have, you know, many people at sea at any one time. So it's part of them sort of saying, well, you know, we've been very terrestrial in the way in which we understand government and power and politics. We kind of take dry land for granted. We assume that politics and power happens on dry land and that sea in the air is a bit of an exception. And, you know, when I was working on stowaways and beginning to read this sort of technical documentation produced by the shipping companies and insurance companies, they're seeing the world from the sea. You know, they talk about repatriation corridors, which are where are the best places on Earth to get people off the ship. So they're identifying what they say is sort of Achilles' heels, particular ports where either the regulations are quite soft or the officials are bribable. So, you know, you've got these stowaways, where are you most likely to get them off? Which ports should you avoid? Which countries are really tough and going to fine us or detain the boat or the ship for a long time? Right? So they have their own maps of how to get people off. So they're seeing the world from the point of view of the sea. You know, we live and we do our business at sea, and our problem is how to get you onto dry land because you're interrupting our trade, our business, right? Anyway, so air power is one thing that an expanded notion of air power would be, I think, to critique and move us beyond that kind of terrestrial, not territorial, but terrestrial centrism, to sort of give air and sea a much greater sort of presence in the way in which we think about power and governmentality. So air power then would be, you know, thinking about the different ways in which aviation distributes and moves and controls population. It would include thinking about some of these different forms of involuntary movement. I mean, for example, when I first heard that deportees, 3 or 4 of them, would be placed on a large plane amidst loads of tourists and business people, I thought, wow, I can't believe that. That's scary. Who would have thought? And then, you know, reading the work recently about the historian of migration, Alan Fogelman. And Fogelman says, between the early 1600s and the early 1800s, as far as the relationship between Europe and British North America, 3/4 of all people who moved across the ocean did so in some state of unfreedom. So there was a sort of spectrum of, from enslavement at one end to various forms of indenture and servitude in the middle that were partly related to paying off your passage or being transported as a criminal. So really, sort of free movement was the exception rather than the norm, but what was quite normal was that ships were carrying people with a whole range of different conditions of freedom and unfreedom. And, so it's only because we naturalised and normalised, a nexus of mobility and freedom that we sort of think, wow, there are deportees on this plane. The last thing I'd say about air power, and so I admit this is a very roughly worked out idea at the moment. This poster really caught my eye. It comes from about 1922. Imperial Airways, which is predecessor of what is British Airways today. So Imperial Airways, what we're doing here is we're rewinding the tape, right? So 1920s, aviation was just kind of beginning. Right, the Wright brothers did their thing in 1904 or whatever it was. But as a serious apparatus or a system, aviation is getting going by the 1920s. And you can see a country like Britain, it becomes this sort of last gasp of empire. So a lot of the British politicians and policymakers, not to mention the aviators, are sort of saying, wow, aviation, we've got this non-contiguous dispersed empire which is falling apart and all sorts of problems. And they're beginning to think, civil aviation will knit it together. So all sorts of imperial dreams and fantasies come to be sort of worked out around this emerging technology. But just as today people are having all sorts of fantasies about drones, a lot of them really are sort of fantasies. But the drone has sort of drawn dreams and nightmares, right? It's sort of like a lightning rod for it. Then civil aviation, when we rewind the tape, we go back to the 1920s where it was anything but prosaic, was also a space of fantasy and excitement and fear and desire, right? So there's a lot to be learnt then from going back to the 1920s. The other thing that catches my attention about this image is that the civil versus the military had not really been distinguished at that point. So Imperial Airways is a state-owned company whose aim is to sort of get civil aviation, get commercial aviation going and put it to sort of state purposes, use it to strengthen state and empire and image and prestige. But in this image, we see these flying boats that Imperial Airways has just taken possession of. And what strikes me about the image is they just look like a squadron of bombers, even though this is the beginnings of commercial aviation. So there's something there about how the civil and the military hadn't been prized apart, whereas they've been prized apart today. So that we look at military aviation, and we often think it's quite sinister and scary and violent, potentially. Whereas we look at civil aviation, we just think of networks and aviation and connection and globalization and speed and mobility and all these positive things. But I'm saying, if we think of civil aviation as itself a political technology, we think of it in terms of air power, then we might think about its underside and its entanglements and its affordances and, that it's a system of power. It's not just happy globalization and speed and velocity. And so deportation really gets at that. It sort of opens up the multiple purposes, the multiple uses, the multiple affordances of this seemingly benign, happy system of civil aviation. And of course it's critiqued from other angles as well. We have an environmental critique of civil aviation, which is also a different sort of problematization of air power, you might say, that sort of says to you as an individual, people were doing this about 10 years ago, maybe I shouldn't fly so much, maybe and then the airlines sort of latched on and they do all these sort of carbon accounts where you can sort of trade and make yourself feel a bit more ethical, a bit more green by the choices you make. But that also, you might say, is a problematization of air power.
We have time for one more. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think among the many interesting and important questions that you've opened up for us and the concept you've settled here, we've also forever changed our experience riding on a plane. So, thank you so much, everybody.
I have a student, by the way, who works with the dead. He's a sort of, his job is to remove dead bodies from either crime scenes or just when someone dies in an apartment to do it quite. But he says, typically every big plane that you fly on, the dead are on board the plane as well with another.
Okay, well, before we thank Wiliam and get going, I just want to remind you or advertise our next talk, which is by Rosel Pereñas on Friday. The title is Serial Labor Migration, Expulsion and Domestic Worker Patterns of Temporary Migration, and that will be, is this room or the room next door? 104 at 2 o'clock on Friday. And if you want more details, please join about that event or any other event, join our mailing list, and you just Google Zolberg Institute, you'll see our main page, and you can subscribe right there. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Wiliam, for
Thank you for coming.
Wonderful.